$1 billion. That's the key word people usually want in life, whether it be to have it or to celebrate it. The celebration part is usually the more realistic part because not many people will hold the first. Where when we talk about that, we usually refer to films where $1 billion is the biggest benchmark for success for many modern studios. Again, that number has been plentiful since the early 2010s, as films exploded in cinema, franchises and many sequels of every kind from its initial rarity that few has ever achieved. Yet even so, a film that does reach such a number is still a rare achievement out of the many films that get released by studios per year. It is the high quality of what attracts many people to sit in theaters and make the big bucks. And one such studio that has done so well in this is actually Pixar. Contrary to its original standing and uneven recovery, the one thing that is consistent with Pixar in this modern age is the high grossing sequels, where this pattern yet again has continued with Toy Story 5 that is well on its way to do $1 billion and even outgross Toy Story 4 surprisingly enough. Like, for how many people beforehand talk about or groan about another Toy Story film, you can't ignore that it's been very consistent in its growth of money. But it hasn't just been Toy Story. It's been the broader pattern for Pixar overall to expect their sequels to grow in popularity in both ways from their originals. This is in comparison to the mixed reality that other studios have had in their sequels, especially Illumination with their Minions and Mario movies that have decreased from their predecessors despite their own big success regardless. And sure, Disney Animation itself does have those increases with big names like Zootopia, Frozen and the Moana sequels, but I don't think there had been such a balanced case such as what Pixar has done for the most part, where sequels have generally increased in such a way for the most fact, even in their weaker films that I have derided. And it's just so interesting where you have to actually ask, why do they do so well with this? What makes it tick to the point where they increase tenfold over their original films? It's an answer that should be simple, but also not quite when the dynamics of each film are still so different from each other, because Inside Out is not Toy Story and Cars is not Incredibles, but it just works regardless because it's what Pixar brings to families well. Now to start, we understand this fact. Toy Story 2 was the first biggest sequel pushed by Pixar after Disney saw the success of the first Toy Story film, becoming their third big film. And when we look at Toy Story 2 and its hectic history about the film getting saved on one file from being completely deleted or whatever regarding such a mess, we understand that Toy Story 2 captured a great essence of what made the first film work and expanded it more in a great way with new characters like Jessie and Bullseye. The heart and charm was there, and the world expanded to a very relatable degree that felt fresh and balanced on both viewpoints. Aspects that consist of what it's like to feel forgotten and changing it for the better. And the film was such a great success in theaters on its budget that it increased from the original's $360 million gross to a $511 million gross on a $90 million budget. A massive boost for Pixar at the time for its highest grossing film that beat out the box office of the original and Bug's Life, which does make tons of sense. Toy Story 2 is one of the rare sequels that are considered to be better than the original, and that is a fact, because honestly, when you look at the story that we just talked about with the new characters and the growth of the story on both Woody and Buzz's end, you see it makes every right decision ever for a movie. And this created such a boost for Pixar's image that Disney never really had before, since The Rescuers Down Under was a sequel that didn't really succeed. That Toy Story 2 really changed the game for sequels overall, where they showed they can be great or better than the first in terms of storytelling and box office. Yet even that was still the last sequel they did for a while until Toy Story 3's release, because everyone remembers the 2000s was just Pixar's golden age of high quality films. Yet also the ideal starting point of where future sequels would be in the next decade. And that said, Toy Story 3 was that real starting point of Pixar's sequel success age, as that film became Pixar's first to achieve the high mark of $1 billion, at a time where it was again pretty rare to do so, but also proof of how big it was. Because again, it was in fact a quality sequel that felt like a neat tie-in to the Andy trilogy, as I would like to call it now. Like, if you wanted a perfect conclusion, this was the type of film to do it, with the fact of Andy being grown up and how the toys have to cope with this reality and how to move on from it, where no matter what in this part, people just loved the film's conclusive message and perseverance. A time where Andy growing up is the same as many kids who saw the first Toy Story film now becoming adults by the time here in 2010, and some possibly also being parents by that point, creating a new chain of kids who get introduced to the Toy Story, since that film did introduce characters like Bonnie and the daycare as new kids, the endless chain of playtime and kids that exist in any age. Pixar by this film managed to create this delicate balance of nostalgia and its power with great storytelling that new generations can get into, and that you don't necessarily have to watch the previous films to get what its meaning is about in the concept of a Toy Story. And even the weaker parts like Cars itself managed to increase in the same time. Unless frankly, sadly enough, we talk about Cars 3 as an outlier of its low gross, where the worst Pixar film and Cars 2 did manage to gross more than the original Cars film despite its stupid issues, which I guess is because the brand had grown to that point and wasn't horrible enough for many to dislike beyond myself. Which on that fact, Cars does have this weird pattern about itself, being the second franchise to have more than 2 films, but how it's not as strong or consistent considering its downturn from the third film, despite it being a strong return from the roots of the franchise than Mater trying to be a crappy James Bond. But even so again, while it had its ups and down moments, Cars just had the appeal where many still went back to it. Not a massive billion-dollar jump, but not a massive decline either, and it was consistent in the type of people who watched it. But the biggest break for Pixar came in the form of Finding Dory, the first major sequel to a property outside of Toy Story or Cars from the Golden Age, and Nemo was one of the higher points with how much the original made, with its $871 million gross in 2003, the highest that surpassed Toy Story 2 even back then for Pixar. So such a film would be a major test for them, being 13 years after the first with a major focus on Dory instead of Marlin and Nemo and how they're still involved. And yet again, they did it. They made over $1 billion with this film due to the talents of Andrew Stanton coming again, creating a surprisingly emotional story for Dory and her family history onto something that fits the image of Nemo and expands the finding part and what it means. Because you know the original was literally about finding where Nemo was stolen, but this one was more in the essence of finding Dory as the finding out who she was as a character, as we knew played by Ellen. That's just such a perfect frame for a sequel where despite it not being Toy Story 2 greater than the original film, it was on par with the emotional moments and growth of the characters in both the main and the old we focused to become part of the broader family. And the impact of that decade time gap created the anticipation of great nostalgia for the film you loved at first and now reminding you again why you love it now and why it communicates something both young and old. It's not a big time period from how kids watched the first Toy Story to the third film, but it's still enough where you're in the middle of where you're old enough to find yourself in reality. A great mix of kids who are now more teens by the time they saw Dory, who are now just getting started in life, where Dory is trying to find herself, which paid off well with its record-breaking opening for a domestic animated film to its final gross of $486 million domestic and over $500 million worldwide to create that billion. And this was the benchmark that showed that Pixar can do something really special with sequels, that they don't do bad, but they simply expand. Which that next test translated into something more explosive with The Incredibles 2, 2 years later opening to the highest animated opening ever of $182 million, a record-breaking weekend that no animated film has even achieved close yet to its $608 million final and $1.2 billion worldwide. Where in the past, this is another film I've noted as weaker than the original's message and the rare miss on the villain and the circumstances, but it's still no Cars 2. And the point of why Incredibles was so huge in this way has to do with how anticipated this was in the general public, where people really wanted a sequel and had to wait 14 years for it, a long time coming. Which is the most astounding fact because the original only grossed $631 million worldwide, which is more of the median gross of Pixar's Golden Age films in the 2000s, where such films were not the highest of its time like Nemo at all, yet it built something great. The Incredibles was the most important of the bunch because it revolved around family and the circumstances of mediocrity and the search for more adult themes in a very family-friendly movie, where I've made clear that the sequel neutered it to be more enjoyable as simply a family-friendly movie, since the strongest points are the family itself with Bob and the kids more than the crappy other parts, which originally when I watched it, I did generally love that part, since we couldn't expect a quality sequel villain from Syndrome likes. And because the gross was so big, lots of families also felt that way too, because it was a film that showcased the pains and realities of raising a family and a job that Bob hasn't done as a dad trying to cope with themselves, as they too have the burden of those roles of family life. It's beautiful, funny, and artistically well done by Brad Bird despite the overall disagreements with how it wasn't the best for a sequel. That just represents the peak of where Pixar could go with their films and the general popularity and culture and how much it earned. $1.2 billion to remind ourselves, and we'll see how that third film will build on that. But again, Pixar wasn't done here yet with the other properties, as the tail end of this decade would see out with Toy Story 4, the film you can criticize on a lot of way for the frame of its characters, as we have done on occasion, yet how it remained to be a heartfelt conclusion to Woody's arc and the journey of toys for a new era and the purpose of what they do for kids in the ever-growing path of life. But the most insane part of this was that Toy Story 4 increased from Toy Story 3, just about 7 million more. Not a big jump, but a jump nonetheless, from $1.67 billion to $1.74 billion, which represents the enduring popularity that we'll see at the end of this video with the increase of Toy Story 5's run. But after this, Pixar did take a break for obvious reasons of COVID, but they did roll on more with the original films that didn't have the best release schedule. And we're not here to focus on that since we've had plenty to say on what went right or what went wrong, because the bigger test for the comeback was Inside Out 2, which we know today until China had its big moment with its Neja film, that Inside Out 2 had taken the world by storm in 2024 as the highest grossing animated film of all time, almost $1.7 billion off an opening as big as 154 million. Not as big as The Incredibles opening, yet legged out better domestically, beating that film at $654 million. As we've covered it out when it did came out, it was totally the most insane thing coming at the time just after Disney's 2023 misfire year for something so big as what it did for Pixar that just had even beaten Endgame in several nations like Brazil and Mexico with those grosses. And we have to keep in mind that Inside Out 2 was the new crop after the first film came out in Pixar's 2010s period, as the original was well liked for its concept of emotions and learning to accept some of them. And what we know by this film, it did everything right to expand the emotions originally thought to be redundant, like anxiety and the relatable pressures kids or teens have in their life from the original's message of moving period and stressful appearances of who you are. And this film was surprising to even do what the numbers it did, because it originally was only projected to make $80 or $90 million on its opening weekend. Not bad, but not as quite as big, but then it suddenly took off on a level not even the previous sequels have ever done, literally doubling the original film's gross that was at $860 million worldwide 9 years earlier to that $1.7 billion. And even regardless of the other films, it has remained to be the highest grossing domestic animated film that beat out The Incredibles 2, which makes sense because this film has all the right ingredients in its story and its emotion and individual elements that makes expansion not feel repetitive but necessary. It still showed that same commitment and the quality of it that matters when the heart is down to it. Sure, originals should be more valued in many ways and they've always had rough spots, but it's also great that you can expand upon a work later that also adds to it and has more growth in its first frame. Inside Out 2 continued the age-old tradition of Pixar sequels answering where does life take you after the first part is done. And this is the pattern I've noticed with each film and their sequels and why they do so succeed so well. They channel in the next step of life more than just being there like many other sequels just tend to do. Because to really capture what nostalgia means or what new generations can be taught, you first have to understand the growth of a person in their life and where they are from 1 to 100 years old. Where does your path lead and head to a certain aspect or area, where Pixar has been able to answer these questions with these examples that are able to bridge the gaps in their films so they are not one note. And regardless of what you can say about it, they have acquitted themselves well in regards to how each film is able to achieve great success and they can never say outright that they bomb at all. The balance that serves them well compared to many other studios and their own sequels that are financially well but critically another story. And speaking of another story does bring us back to that Toy Story 5 point, with its own reception still adding to that conversation, still creating great heart and respect to what it accomplished before and not hateable by any standard of their focus to grow the role of toys in the digital age that is more important than ever. And if projections are to go by with this chart as of this day and how much is left in the tank for Toy Story 5 as of this time of the recording, it's well on its way to surpass Toy Story 4's complete gross as well as to hit another billion. Another win that shows its growth here both domestically as we could see here versus 4 and worldwide when all is said and done. That once again, Pixar delivers what they can do best in the best possible way because they never forget or lose sight of the bigger picture, even when hounded to do such sequels where they manage to put in the effort above all so that nobody goes angry with who they were or who they are now or who they live under obviously. And it is with this continued commitment that Pixar will manage to stay within the hearts and minds of generations that still remember this fondly of what can be done that is good in both past and present nostalgia or new creations, and we hope that it can surely continue. And if it takes another sequel to continue their positive appeal, then it is really for the better for it, for what sequels are to come with Coco, potentially Inside Out again, and The Incredibles. And with that said, that's all there really is to it. I'm all done. Goodbye.